The Dickheads are presented in color.
Hello and welcome. Oh, excuse me. I'm doing the wrong podcast. Like a pink laser beam of truth beaming from California to your brain hole. Welcome to the Dickheads podcast. This is a very special episode, and I have a special guest here tonight. Walter Nelson is the son of Philip K. Dick's very good friend, Ray Nelson, who we recently lost at 91 years old, and we definitely have been looking for a way to celebrate his life for the Dickheads podcast. So we're really excited to have Walter here. Welcome to the show, Walter.
Thank you.
And of course, he was one of Phil's very good friends. So,
Yes.
yeah. Let's talk about his childhood. What do you know about his younger years?
Oh, well, let's see. He was born in Schenectady, but lived most of his childhood in Cadillac, Michigan.
Mhm.
His father was an electrical engineer, and his mother was the daughter of a lumber baron named Fred L. Reed. So they didn't really lack for money.
Mhm.
And let's see, he seemed to be interested in science fiction from a fairly early age. He talked frequently about his visit to the New York World's Fair in 1939.
And that's where he got his first science fiction magazine, right?
Yeah, and and met was it Electro, the smoking Westinghouse robot, and saw the General Motors Futurama and all those other very the whole bright world of tomorrow message that the 1939 World's Fair was putting out very much appealed to him.
Well, and it's funny because I talked to a very long running fandom person that the other day, and they said Ray Nelson was in the early years of fandom was a guy who was known for dressing up and having a lot of fun at conventions. That he was considered kind of like one of those people that was really fun at the party in those early years, which is cool. But as far as now, there is some conflicting things. So maybe like he did talk about having met Phil when they were kids, but did he have a connection to Berkeley, or was that just a story they told? Because they were both storytellers, mind you. Um, because he talked about meeting him at Hillside Elementary, and I've been to Hillside Elementary in my research on Phil. Ursula Le Guin also went there, which is interesting, but I don't find anything in Ray's history that shows that he would have been in Berkeley, right? Um,
Yeah, well, I'm a little vague on their travels,
right.
but I did find in in among my mother's and my father's photograph collection when I was clearing out the house, I found a collection of photographs, some of which were very likely aerial photographs taken by my grandfather, who was a pilot as well as an electrical engineer. And visible in these photographs is the the tower at the World's Fair on Treasure Island,
Oh,
and that was
interesting.
built in 1938 and torn down in 1942. So they were in the Bay Area
Right.
around 1940.
Right. Yeah, and so it's one of the funny things because it's with Phil and his life, all the scholars and the people that are that we work on these things, we know so much of the movement of Phil's life that it's hilarious because every time Ray Nelson mentioning that he met Phil when they were kids, a lot of the scholars were like, that doesn't make any sense. How did he meet him? But they both agreed on it. They both said that this was a thing. Although one time, I think Phil said that he didn't really. He said that he met Ray in the early '60s. So there is, but the other thing about that is Phil contradicted himself constantly. So it's hard to say, but
Yeah,
I just wondered if there was any, and that's interesting that that picture exists.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, of course, I have only a kind of sketchy concept of what happened before I appeared on the scene,
Right.
and a little sketchy even after I appeared, at least for a few
Right.
years.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. And because these guys like to spin yarns, so we know that about the situation. So, um,
yeah.
do you know much about how your father ended up in Paris in the 50s? Because he was there at a really cool time and doing interesting things there too, right?
Yeah. Now I guess his family, his parents and his brother had gone to Europe just before then, and he joined them there, and then they went home and left him there. Um,
Right.
my uncle says that they were that they visited Spain during that time, and my father acquired a guitar. Which I've got. Is it? Oh, well, I got it somewhere around here. Which, in I guess Barcelona. Um, and then but then at that point, my uncle went home sometime in early '58, I guess, and
Right.
then
Well,
my father met my mother at the Alliance Française, which is a language school. My mother was a Norwegian stewardess in training, and they I guess they sent her to Paris to learn French, and instead she married an American. Um,
I was gonna say it's a good thing he got left behind in Paris, or we wouldn't be having this conversation, right?
yeah, yeah. So I was born in Paris. My dad says that he met that he met and hung out with the existentialists. Um, um,
Mhm.
but
Well, he definitely was known for hanging out with the Beats,
oh yeah,
and he and Michael Moorcock were known for smuggling books out of France that were banned in other countries,
uh-huh.
especially Henry Miller books. I know that was like part of the story is that they were bringing banned books back.
Yeah. That's what he
Um,
told me too.
yeah, and which is kind of a cool, very rebellious thing to to be doing, right? Um,
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
he said that he earned a few extra francs um, um, with that guitar being
Mm.
Tex, le cowboy qui chante, the singing cowboy, in singing singing for tips at various places around Paris.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
and
that's cool. And what's interesting too is that this was early around, I think, I'm not sure if he was already active in fandom and science fiction before he got involved with the Beats, but it's
I think he was. I think he became active in science fiction in the late '40s when he
right.
was still a kid.
Well, and it's funny because and we'll get to the propeller beanie in a bit because it's
Yeah.
important. But the first time he wore the propeller beanie, it's in the Joe Walton's informal history of the Hugo Awards. Ray Nelson wearing the propeller beanie at one of the earliest, Hugo Award ceremonies is in the book. It's mentioned in the book
Okay.
that was while other people were in full Flash Gordon costumes and things and cosplays that Ray Nelson was walking around in his propeller beanie. But the interesting thing about that is by going to France and getting involved with the Beats, he was a part of that golden age of science fiction, but he was also into more radical things. So when the new wave came in the 60s, he was in a really great place in the Bay Area hanging out with that crew, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
I vaguely remember um, attending some sort of meeting where Grania Davis, among others, was present as a kid, and then I'd go off in the backyard and play.
right, right. Well, I think, and I'll get to that too, because those are famous too, because I think by the torch had been passed to your father at a certain point, and he was teaching a lot of those workshops in the early 70s after Tony Boucher. But after he died, I believe it was your father that kind of like took up the mantle for a little while, teaching at the Unitarian Church in San Francisco, is what I read. But as far as meeting your mother, obviously that but much like Phil too, your mother was his third wife, I believe, right? Already.
At that point, yeah, she was his third wife.
Yeah, and so uh, that they came back to raise you guys, raise you in California. Am I correct? Right? Like
Yes.
was that the decision? Like we're gonna raise the kids in California. Was that why they came back or came to California?
Well, my
You know?
dad, the story he told me was that he wanted to stay in France, but his visa had expired, and he couldn't renew it in France. And once he was back in the States, he was kind of there. Um,
Right.
and I guess the first thing they did was they headed to Chicago so he could finish getting his degree, and then they headed over to El Cerrito, where I grew up, and I guess it was 1962. I think that, or 61 maybe. Because yeah, we arrived in the United States in 1960. I've actually been able to get the exact date, which I don't have at the tip of my tongue, but thanks to Ancestry.com, I found the arrival the arrival information for my immigration, the immigration information from my mother.
Got it. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, and so once he came here, like, and got to the Bay Area, he was very involved with the science fiction community almost immediately. And by at this point, you would have been, well, you were born in 1960. Sorry to, I don't,
1958.
1958.
Yeah, I
Okay,
was
so
about
by
18 months
then,
old when I came to the United States.
right. So you, I don't know, at a very young age, you must have been around a lot of these science fiction people.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I have very distinct memories of Phil because he spent a lot of time at our house, and we visited him a lot. He even babysat me. But first, yeah, getting off on
Sorry about
a
that. I got muted.
yeah.
Okay. Now, if you're talking about Philip K. Dick babysitting you, we gotta go into this a little bit since we
All
are
right.
it's podcast. What was that experience like? What do you remember of that? I mean,
Well,
you were pretty young.
I remember just he had this house that sort of was on the water and sticking out over a mud flat, and I enjoyed playing in that area. But I also I do distinctly remember that the first time I ever touched a real gun was when I was being babysat by Phil Dick, and he said, "Walter, you want to look at this?"
Oh my God. It
As
was
I
a
remember
pistol.
very distinctly, it was a Colt over and under Derringer.
So your parents thought, okay, the person that we trust to leave our son with is Philip K. Dick. Okay. Right. And so
Yep,
is this the house in Marin County that
it
like
must have been. I was quite young, so I don't have a clear sense of it, but I had this feeling it must have been Marin County.
all right. So what's interesting about this time too, and the idea that do you ever remember? I mean, you remember him handing you that gun, but do you ever remember him talking? Did he ever tell you stories or any of that kind of stuff? Or and did you have any idea what he did as a living, like that he was a writer or any of that?
I knew he was a writer because I knew my dad was a writer, and I knew they were writers together.
Right.
Um, and I think I became aware fairly early on that they had collaborated on a book on the Ganymede takeover.
Right.
Um, yeah, I knew what Phil did. Um,
Mhm.
I have when I see like film of Phil, there's immediate recognition. Oh, that's Phil Dick. Um,
Right.
but I don't have really a lot of distinct memories. I remember once about the only one I have is kind of a random one. I was we were talking about something, and I said that'd be like paying somebody to not think, and Phil said, "Hmm, there's an idea." I don't think he ever did anything with it, but
Well,
uh,
I have a lot of his unused outlines from the archives. So I'll look for it. I'll let you know. But there is one that he never wrote about a world where insomnia was outlawed and people were forced to sleep to make them better workers. And for example, it's just interesting. But so your father, though, played a very important role in the book that all of us at the Dickheads podcast, all three of our hosts, consider his ultimate masterpiece. And you may not have known this, but it was your father who did the final edits on the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, which we consider to be his best book.
I did
Because
not know that.
yes, because it was while he was living with Grania in Oakland after he left Anne, and he was so frightened by the book he wouldn't look at it. Like, and he said, "Ray, can you do the final edits?" And Ray apparently came by Oakland, picked up the manuscript, and did the edits, and was the one who mailed it back to New York. And so that's a really fascinating, fun, and interesting part of the connection between Ray Nelson and Philip K. Dick, because in a lot of ways, like Phil wrote the book, and it's obvious that Phil wrote the book, right? But it's interesting to think that your father had an editorial hand in what we consider to be one of his tightest and best books. So
Okay.
it's something to put out there. And we only know that because he briefly mentioned in an interview at one point, he said, he just offhandedly mentions, I was so terrified of that book, I wouldn't look at it again. I asked Ray to do the edits. And we don't know any more details than that. We don't know, how it went down, but we know that. And although there's, you never know with Phil, because sometimes he may have been saying that as a story to say, like, it's so to sell the book. It's so frightening. I couldn't even look at it. We don't know if we had asked your father, he might have been like, I didn't do the edits on that.
That's entirely possible.
Right.
Or he might say, "Oh, well, Phil said I did. Well, then I guess I must have."
I guess I must have done it. Right. And so let's talk about the propeller beanie. I mean, he's had to have talked about this a lot. And I love the quote that your father said that long after my books have turned to ashes and dust, the propeller beanie will be spinning somewhere, which was or something to that effect. It was very funny because you know noted there's a Dick scholar, David Gill, and he always loves to say Ray Nelson, the inventor of the propeller beanie. And he must have been really amused by this, right?
Oh yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah,
He was very very pleased with himself for that. Whether or not he actually fabricated it is an open question. His brother is dubious. However, I look at the propeller beanie and I think, my father was building model airplanes back then, and you could have taken the propeller off of one of those balsa wood flyers and put it on a stick and put it on an existing hat, just a little beanie, and you'd have a propeller beanie. You wouldn't have it. Wouldn't be a major engineering feat. But I don't know whether he actually invented it or simply introduced it to fandom.
Right.
And I have a feeling that unless someone can find a patent that predates his wearing of it, that we may just have to just have to shrug and say, we'll never know. But what is it from the man who shot Liberty Valance when the when history and legend collide? Print the legend.
Right. Well, another thing that's interesting about the connection to that your father and Phil had, by the way, too, is that since Phil had already had success for a decade before their friendship started, and what's really interesting to me is that Phil was very invested. If you look at all the ancillary material to Ganymede Takeover and all the quotes that you can find about it from Phil, is that Phil was really active in pushing your father's career forward and really wanting to help your father. In fact, he wanted to write more books with him, but of course, Don Wollheim, who was notoriously cheap about paying writers, didn't want to pay collaborators, for more books. But Phil wanted to write. Phil and Ray had plans at one time to write several books together, right? And so it was really interesting that, and I don't know from the perspective around your father or how he felt about it later, but it really seemed to me like Phil was extremely supportive of Ray as a writer and as a person, that he just really wanted to help him. It just really seemed like that to me. But and I don't know if you know anything about that, but it's just really cool to see, because if you see a lot of the quotes around Ganymede Takeover, he's suggesting that Ray jump on other books with him to Wollheim, and Wollheim's in letters saying I don't need to pay another writer. I want you to write these books. And I think it's also because at the time too, Phil was feeling like he was slowing down, like he had overtaxed himself writing. 63 and 64, where he wrote 5 books in as many months, right? But your father eventually was publishing on his own.
Yeah.
And but before we get to that, the next and one thing that, according, now I'm only going by Wikipedia on this, but when your father was teaching these writers groups according to Wikipedia, it says the First Unitarian Church in San Francisco. Well, it just says San Francisco Bay Area, but it says one of his earliest students there was Anne Rice, which is interesting.
Yeah. It actually wasn't in San Francisco.
Okay.
The church was it is actually in the East Bay. It's in I think it's technically Berkeley, but it's a kind of a posh hilltop suburb called Arlington. And in fact, that's the family's had a connection to that place for many years, and that's when my dad's memorial next month is going to be at that Unitarian church. Now, I think it got started there. It was going to be it was supposed to be like a free university, and that was a big thing in Berkeley back then. The free university,
Right.
where they'd round up a teacher and say, "Hey, teach stuff," and they did. They were going to do a free university thing on writing, and then the teacher didn't show up, and my dad said, "Well, I'm a writer," and the meetings then moved to the Berkeley house of a friend named Avis Worthington, and went on there for many years. And then eventually, I think it must have been in the 80s after I left, that moved to my dad's house in El Cerrito. Um, but I attended several of those. I didn't really know that I didn't get to know all of the the names of all the other people. I imagine Anne Rice must have been there
Yeah.
among them. I sat in on a few of them. Um,
Well, and your father's most famous short story, and of course, we'll eventually be talking about They Live, but
yes.
his most famous short story was sold to the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and although it was not during the era that Boucher was editing the magazine, he was still kind of in an advisory role. So I'm imagining there's a chance that that story and Turn the Sky, I believe was his first
Turn
one.
off the sky.
Turn Off the Sky, yeah. I'm sure they were workshopped at because your father was in the last kind of group of writers that went to Boucher's workshops before he passed, and so really a part of a really fine tradition in science
Hmm.
fiction. A lot of big names came out of there. Did you ever meet Tony Boucher? Because he's a pretty famous figure in all this too.
I don't remember.
Mhm.
I met a lot of Dad's friends, but
Right.
didn't necessarily realize that they were, famous or
Important.
important.
Yeah. As far as like the lasting impact, I think one of the cool things, so 8 o'clock in the morning is the story that eventually was turned into They Live. But just as a story that he wrote in the 60s, it's an incredibly powerful kind of paranoid sci-fi story just on its own. And whereas
Hmm.
the movie is very funny, the story is very dark and hard hitting.
Yeah, and it doesn't have a happy ending.
Not at all, no. Um, that had to be one that not just because of the movie, but it had to be one of those stories that he remained probably very proud of for a long
Yes.
time. Yeah. Yeah. And Turn Off the Sky is also kind of considered a classic as well of the short stories. And that was really his first huge, big sale. And so those are short stories that if our listeners are looking for stories that they want to read from Ray Nelson of the short stories, those are two that are must-haves. And one of the cool things that I discovered in the process of doing my research for my virtual Zen review was that there's like 18 versions of 8 o'clock in the morning that people have done their own audiobook narrations of on
Okay.
YouTube. Right. And
All
there's
right.
some, yeah, and some of them are really, really good, you know, because it only takes like 12, 13 minutes to read. So
Yeah.
a lot of, I think my theory on this is that a lot of audiobook narrators are using it as a sample. It's a story that they're reading as like a, hey, look at me, you should hire me to do these. And and it's kind of a neat thing that's out there. So the story I highly recommend. I actually listened to two or three of them the other day for like a little bit and then chose one that I decided to listen all the way through that I thought was the best. In the show notes for this episode, I'll put the link to the one that I liked the best. So people,
Okay.
um, but as far as it was really in the 70s that he hit his stride as a novelist. And a lot of people consider Blake's Progress to be his masterpiece. Now, I
Hmm.
admit, I've read Virtual Zen, but of the novels, I have not read his three novels that he wrote in the 70s and Prometheus Man in 82. They're on my list. I'm going to get to them. But I've read Ganymede Takeover and I've read Virtual Zen. But one of the things that's interesting for me is that Ganymede Takeover, you can really tell your father's voice does come through because as somebody who's read everything that Philip K. Dick's written, I can see his hand in it. And so that's kind of a cool thing. What do you know about? I mean, you were around, he was your father when he
Yeah.
was writing these books in the 70s. What do you know anything much about his output during that era?
Um, well, I mean, I was aware of it, and um, I remember he was doing a lot of Blake research, a lot
Hmm.
of reading, a lot of going to the library and buying books and so forth, getting everything he could on Blake, um, and talking a lot about Blake at the time. He was very focused on Blake and his world in during the creation of that.
Yeah, and it really paid off. And I know most commentators consider that to be his masterpiece, the Blake's Progress. Um, Now, I watched a bit of the Penultimate Truth interviews with your father that was filmed in his office. And look, my father was a professor and and that office looked a little similar to me. It's, as far as it was piled up with books and papers everywhere. Was your dad's workspace always like that when you were growing up, or was that one that slowly developed over time? Because it looked
uh,
really cool.
oh yeah, yeah. Well, it's referred to as the Ivory Tower. It was an addition that was put in by the previous owners of the house, but we what we had was a two-story house, and they just plopped a little penthouse on the very top.
Interesting.
And so yeah, from the second floor, you'd go up a narrow staircase, and there'd be this room with windows on three sides, um, and bookshelves, and it was. I remember it had been very cluttered, and then my dad decided that it was time to become neat, and then it became very neat, and everything had little labels on it.
Oh, wow. That's
I mean,
interesting.
it was always cluttered even when it was neat, but I mean, it used to be messy. But then I guess he had this epiphany that it was better to be organized than messy. And after that, he was very organized.
Now, one of the things that Philip K. Dick was known for, and this relates to your father, I swear, but one of the things Philip K. Dick was known for, and I'm working currently on a book that involves reading a lot of Phil's outlines and works in progress. And if you look even at like Ubik, or if you look at some of his most classic books, Valis, he had a tendency to map out the characters and put real life human beings in his life as the inspirations. And a lot of times he would list three real life people per character.
No,
And
interesting. Okay.
yeah, and your father shows up quite a bit. And so what he'll do is like he'll have a character like Joe Chip in Ubik, and then he'll write Ray, Hugh, and John. And like, so for a lot of this, like, we have to, like, when I'm looking at these things, I have to try and figure out who Hugh, Ray, and John are. And a lot of times, like, I know Ray, and some of the names I don't know. And a lot of them, like, his old boss at the record store is one of those repeated characters. But your father was an important inspiration for one of his most famous characters because he claimed to have based Roy Batty in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep on your father, and which, of course, was the character that Rutger Hauer played in
Yep.
Blade Runner.
Yeah, my,
Um,
my, my dad told me that.
yeah,
And my mother was my mother Kirsten was the inspiration for Pris. So Roy and Pris were Ray and Kirsten.
it's really interesting how, but I have seen your father's name in more than one outline.
I,
So it's
I didn't know he was more than just Roy Batty.
Yeah, he was definitely Roy Batty. And what's really interesting to me too, though, is that when I look at pictures of your father when he was younger and Rutger Hauer, I can kind of see it, right? A little bit. And it's interesting to um, it's funny because Phil, more than most writers, was like really trying to like zero in on certain behaviors that his friends and people around him had. And so it's really interesting to me to look at these things to say, like, how, in what way was he facing these? Like when he's listing these names, I don't know how or why he's doing it, but it's interesting. So your father did talk about being the inspiration for Roy and Press.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I've uh, I occasionally joke about being the spawn of replicants.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's true. You do get that call, that claim to fame. Um,
Yeah.
but another huge thing happened for your father in the 80s, 1988. My favorite filmmaker of all time, John Carpenter, coming off my favorite John Carpenter film, Prince of Darkness. His next movie was They Live, based on your father's story, which had already been
Yeah.
adapted for graphic novel. And I believe Carpenter or whoever was developing the film found it from the graphic novel first.
That's what my dad said. My dad said that it had been in print for like 20 years, in various anthologies, with nary a nibble. But a f- like a few days or weeks after it hit the stands as a graphic novel, his phone was ringing.
Hmm. You're right. And then, well, and it made a really, the imagery in it was incredible for the film. And so it must have been a surreal experience for your father, the short story that he wrote 20 plus years earlier. And here it is, a film in theaters everywhere, right?
Hmm.
Like that had to be a really surreal experience too. But um, it's funny too because I love They Live and I love that movie when I was when I was young. But now that I've seen the story, I prefer the kind of dark tone of the short story a little bit more than although I still love the movie. So, but it's funny because I think then that became his calling card. After
Yeah,
that,
yeah, very much so. Well,
yeah.
it's when I say, "Oh, my dad was a science fiction writer," and people say, "Well, would I have heard of any of his stuff?" I've got something that, though I find it disconcerting how many people haven't heard of They Live.
Yeah, these days, yeah. Well, it's interesting too because doing a Philip K. Dick podcast, I have the same thing where people say, "Well, what's your podcast about?" And mainstream people, and I say, "Well, it's about Philip K. Dick." And they kind of look at me, and I'm like, "Blade Runner, Minority Report, Total Recall." And then they're like, "Oh, okay." You know,
Yeah,
I mean, for literary types and science fiction people, Philip K. Dick is extremely famous, but for most of the mainstream, but there was a moment there in the late 80s where They Live was right up there as one of those, famous movies. And how did he feel about the movie? Was he happy with the movie? I know it changed the tone a bit. I mean, I know he was,
yeah, yeah. And I don't want to go too much into it, but he had a lot of input on the making of the movie too. So.
oh, that's great. Yeah, not every writer gets that, you
Hmm.
know. Um, well, and the chance to have your movie made by John Carpenter is pretty cool. Pretty cool moment too. And interesting guy, John Carpenter. um, but then your father's last novel, and this is the one that I've read, so it's the one I know a lot about, Virtual Zen. I get the impression that he wrote it in the 80s. There's a lot of clues that a lot of like little bits of humor that kind of relate to the late 80s. Even though it didn't get published till 96. Um, what I love about this book is like how kind of delightfully out of date it is. Um, and I don't say this in a negative way, but one of the things I like about it is that you can tell it's written by an older writer who's writing
Mm.
about young hip things of the future, and I kind of love how anachronistic it is in a really interesting way. But there's also moments that for Dickheads, and it's going to be our Dick like suggestion for the next episode of our podcast is that there's moments where you can definitely tell he's like kind of homaging his friend. Like, for example, like when a guy's like having an argument with his door in the book. It's very Philip K. Dick. Now, the only difference is Phil would have had the character not have the money to open the door. Is the big difference between, but nonetheless, it's a really great book, and I really just want to put out there that to people that you know, the one that I've read already. I'm going to read them all eventually, but that one is really great. And um, so do we know too? Because I were there, I'm sure there were there novels that he left that he, trunk novels or things that are still around that because I think
Yes, I've been collecting them, and
right.
um, I've got a manuscript boxes with manuscripts in them that were never published.
Hmm.
In case at some point there's a demand.
Well, we should talk because I know there's certain publishers I know that might be very interested. But the other thing too is that there's archives. Um, I'm not sure, if you've thought about where your father's papers are going to live, but one of the things that's cool for me as an archivist is that I visited Phil's papers, and those for those of us who are fans of the genre, the ability to like I had the chance to touch the first Man in the High Castle draft the last time I was in Fullerton. I do think there would be people that would be interested. Let me just say that. How now, one thing that I wanted to get into really quickly, and then I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but it had to be really interesting because Phil became much more famous after his death. And
Yeah.
his work became, especially when Steven Spielberg's making Ridley Scott and Paul Verhoeven and all these big name Hollywood directors and for a while it was making a Philip K. Dick movie was a hot thing. And then all of his books came back in print and people started to realize the literary genius of this guy, but not till after his death. Now, how was that for your father who was his friend? Did he talk about that?
I don't know. No, we never had that conversation.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I mean, he might have thought about it, but he never discussed it with me.
Yeah. Well, you can tell in the Penultimate Truth documentary that he was very excited to talk about Phil. Like that he enjoyed remembering Phil, that
Oh
he,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, they were well, as you well know, they were very good friends.
yeah, yeah. And you could tell that he was very amused by him. One thing that's interesting too, and your father is from what I've read, was an atheist, right? And Phil had all these interesting religious ideas. And one thing that I saw in one of the notes that because I'm currently we're about to record our Valis episode of our podcast, which is of course, a big deal in the Philip K. Dick thing. And one of the things I saw in the notes when I was looking at things for the exegesis was so the whole thing that inspired Valis was that Phil claimed, that he got shot by a pink laser beam from by God and downloaded all this information. And one of the interesting things that I read was that when he talked to your father about it, all connections to religion, to God, came out of it. Like he didn't tell it that way to Ray. And the thought was that Ray was going to tell him it was a bunch of malarkey or tell him it was all bullshit. So he just didn't go there. And that's kind of the way I believe Tessa recounted it was that she was kind of amused watching Phil because she apparently was hanging out with both of them and saw like, wow, Phil's telling this story very different for Ray the way he tells it for the rest of us, which was interesting and funny. But and I should point out that mentioned on the PKD group that you were coming on here that Tessa said really nice things about your father, about what a nice man he was. So, um, but anyways, so I'm sorry I babbled a lot, but is there anything else you want to say about your father before we go about um, you know ways that we can best remember your dad? I know you've got the celebration of life coming up.
Yeah. Um, well, yeah, well, he was. I guess I don't know. I since he since he was my dad. I mean, he's always going to be just sort of that guy, that dad,
Right.
which is it's very hard to see one's dad as being some fully appreciating perhaps my dad's place in the world because he was just my dad. Um,
Totally. Yeah.
but I haven't read all his work. I haven't read Virtual Zen. That you know I went off left home at in 1981 and after that only just visited a few times a year. So we kind of lost touch through the 80s. Um, but I guess he's just I don't know a storyteller, a man of great imagination, and also a man who was very very generous with his time and his attention for young writers who were or people looking for a hand up in the writing business.
Right. Yeah, and took the chance to carry on the tradition of Tony Boucher to keep teaching and keep reaching out and returning the favor that Phil led to him by like giving him his
Mhm.
first opportunity to publish a novel with Ganymede Takeover. And which one of the things that we first noticed that Ray gave to Phil was to help with his structure, and that's one of because Ganymede Takeover has a much better structure than a lot of Phil's books, and I often think that that's what he gave to Three Stigmata as well, because I think he helped in that final edit bring some
Yeah.
structure to it. That's you
Yeah.
know that's up to debate, but
Mhm.
well, Walter, it was excellent talking about your father. I know he was your dad, and I had the same experience when my father passed. He was a political scientist, and he had huge influence as a professor, and it was mind-boggling to me to meet some of the people that I had no idea, that the different ways that he influenced the world. And so as Phil's good friend, I think it's really important that the people in the Philip K. Dick community remember your father and keep his work alive. And um, so can you, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we're going to get this on the air out to the world before the celebration of life, but we have already posted the link to our
Okay, good.
socials. And you guys are recommending that people like come in costume and propeller beanies and all that. Like,
Wear whatever you might wear to a science fiction convention. I want to keep it light because I think that's what he would have wanted. He wouldn't have wanted a somber ceremony. He certainly, even though it's going to be in a church, a Unitarian church, of course, the religion sits very lightly on on the Unitarian Church, but we're not going to have a clergyman. I guess I'm going to be the master of ceremonies, um, and certainly if there's anyone who wants to say anything, I would love to have people give their testimonials about my dad if they've got anything to offer. Um,
mhm.
it'd be be open mic night. Um, so yeah.
Well,
Um,
I'm sure some of his students will find their way there, and
Well, I hope so. I hope so. I hope I can get the word out to the
Yeah.
Then
Well, and I really appreciate your time, and you're going to be maintaining the website, right, for your father's work, because you're the one that did it, right?
yeah,
This
I'm the one
website.
that did it.
Yeah.
I need to figure out. I need to update it. It's HTML, very very 2001. Um, so it could definitely use an update. Use some more up to date tools. And one of those things I need to get around to. But
Right,
yeah,
and yeah, and it's one of those things too where your father um, may have not had the energy to try and move those novels that he left behind, but there are definitely people who will want to see them. So that's something definitely to think about. And
yeah.
I appreciate your time. And the dickheads can find what's the URL for your father's website?
RayNelson.com.
RayNelson.com. All right, folks. As always on the Dickheads podcast, we remind you to keep it paranoid, and we'll talk again. Thank you, Walter Nelson, for joining us on the Dickheads podcast.
Thank you.